Hello, my name is Peter Coleman, and I am the director of the International Center for Cooperation and Conflict Resolution at Columbia's Teachers College in New York City. And I have the great pleasure today of interviewing the founding director of the ICCCR, we call it, Morton Deutsch. Morton Deutsch is this year's recipient of the Lifetime Achievement Award of the International Society of Justice and Research. And Dr. Deutsch has prepared some remarks, some comments, which are available in the complete text are available on our website, the ICCCR website. So if you go to Teachers College, Columbia University, and search ICCCR, then you can get the complete text of his remarks, which are entitled Justice, Conflict, and Cooperation by Morton Deutsch. But in lieu of a formal reading of his remarks today, we've decided to do a little bit of an interview Q&A between Professor Deutsch and myself, where he'll talk a little bit about his background and his work and some of the practical applications of his work. So please welcome Professor Deutsch, and Mort, if you could tell us a little bit about some of the main influences that inspired your work.
But first I'd like to say I'm delighted and honored by the award, and I'm sorry that I can't be in Adelaide with you to present my talk, but unfortunately it would not be prudent for me to try to do so. The second thing I'd like to say is, though I don't have time to acknowledge my students and all that they have contributed to my work is much indebted to the many wonderful graduate students that I've had during the course of my career. So, what influenced me? I was born in 1920 in a Jewish family, and I was the youngest. Being Jewish meant that in the 20s and 30s, I received and knew about and saw a lot of anti-Semitism. I saw signs saying, no kikes, niggers, or dogs allowed here. Anti-Semitism was much more pervasive then than it is now. I lived during a period of depression, the Holocaust, the Spanish Civil War, and I was in the Air Force during World War II. All of that influenced me to be sensitive to injustice and to want to do something about it during the course of my career. So that's how I partly got influenced by that. Mm-hmm. And then my first step in my career after I came back from the Air Force was to go to MIT and study with Kurt Lewin at his research center for group dynamics. And I studied with Lewin because he was interested in overcoming prejudice and discrimination. He got involved in studies of democratic and autocratic leadership. Mm-hmm. He was concerned with both theory, research, and the importance of having these ideas that he was developing have an impact in the world. Mm-hmm. His motto was, there's nothing so practical as a good theory. Mm-hmm. And that was an important influence on me.
Were there other, I know Lewin was a huge influence on you, on your methods and on your intellectual development. Were there other contributors to your intellectual framework, to how you thought about these problems?
Well, yes. At City College, I got an introduction to Karl Marx and his ideas. Prior to City College, on my own, I had started to read Freud because Freud seemed relevant to some of the personal issues I was struggling with. And Freud, Marx, and sort of the theoretical ambition and achievement of Einstein and his theory of relativity, all of that was an important influence in me during my undergraduate work and had a lasting impact on me. My dissertation was in part influenced by my experience in the war. That is, I felt I was against war, even though I thought the Second World War was a justified war. But the UN Security Council was just formed when I was in graduate school, and I thought that council could either contribute to world peace or could degenerate and contribute to world conflict. And so as I thought about that, and I had to do a dissertation, an experimental dissertation with small groups, I decided to do a dissertation that was relevant to that general idea of world peace and UN Security Council. And it occurred to me that the council could function either in a cooperative way or in a competitive way. And so I turned my thoughts about war and peace into a dissertation on the effects of cooperation upon group process and the effects of competition upon group process. And because this was being done at the Research Center for Group Dynamics, it couldn't simply be an experimental research study. It had to have theoretical ideas underlying it. And so I developed, as part of my dissertation, a theory of cooperation and competition. And fortunately, I did my research, and it largely supported my theory. And so the next thing was, where do I go from there?
Sure.
Well, I didn't go immediately where I wanted to go from a theoretical point of view. I went to work with Stuart Cook at the American Jewish Congress's Commission for Community Interrelations, which was also affiliated with the New School for Social Research, where they gave me an assistant professorship. And there I did a study of racial prejudice by studying integrated public housing and segregated public housing. The integrated housing was a place where the African Americans and the European Americans lived next to one another in the same building. In the segregated housing, they lived in separate buildings. And as one might expect, the effects were that in the integrated housing, people got to know one another, they formed friendly relationships, and attitudes improved in terms of their interracial attitudes as a function of their contacts. While that did not happen, and in fact, kids who went to integrated schools, public schools, became more separated and more prejudiced. Their prejudices were maintained as a result of their housing experiences. In 1949, we moved our whole group to NYU, and Stuart Cook became chair of the department. And there I started a program of research on what led to cooperation, what led to competition. And as I started to think about it, and as I started to develop experiments related to this program, it became clear that one of the interesting ways of doing research would be to do research on negotiation, bargaining, and conflict, which were typically mixed motive situations where there was an interest in coming to an agreement. That was the cooperative side. But there was also typically some interest in getting the best one could, and perhaps even better than the other side during the course of the negotiations. And with the help of many students, both at NYU and then at Bell Labs, where I moved to from NYU, I did a series of research studies using many different kinds of experimental formats related to the question, what determines whether conflict is going to take a constructive or destructive course? And after much research, I came up with a simple idea, which I have immodestly labeled the crude law of social relations.
So, Morton, you published your book on conflict resolution in 1973.
Right.
And was the discovery of the crude law prior to that, or was it after the 73 book?
It was prior to that, and it's published in the book. The crude law, in effect, says that the typical effects of a cooperative relationship tend to induce a cooperative relationship. And the typical effects of a competitive relationship tend to induce a competitive relationship. Thus, a typical effect of a cooperative process is that people communicate openly and honestly. Another typical effect is they treat one another fairly, and fairness is valued. Another typical effect is they tend to like one another and trust one another as a result of their cooperative interaction. Another typical effect is they have an interest in enhancing the abilities and the efforts of the other, rather than weakening the power of the other.
Sure.
While in a competitive situation, it's just the opposite. The typical effect of a competitive situation is that communication tends to break down because you can't trust what the other person is saying. There's development of suspicion rather than trust in one's relationship with the other. One is interested in weakening the power of the other. One is not interested in issues of fairness. One wants to win what one can do in any way you can. And so in my dissertation study, I had studied the typical effects of cooperative process and the typical effects of a competitive process. So I was able to push that into, in a sense, the details of the crude law. But then later I found that the crude law not only applies to cooperation and competition, but applies in areas of justice. That is, if you take a typical canon of justice, equity, where people are rewarded in proportion to their contributions, or equality, where people are rewarded equally, no matter what their relative contributions are, or need, where people are rewarded in terms of what they need. Those typical orientations to, say, a situation which involves some sort of productivity, produce typical psychological orientations. So the first one, the equity principle, produces what I call an economic orientation. The equality principle produces what I call a solidarity orientation. I don't have the time to elaborate the details, but a lot of the research that is relevant is in my book, Distributive Justice, which, by the way, is also now online at ICCCR.
Right, so it was published in 1985.
Right.
originally, but now is also available, in the complete text is available on the ICCCR website as well.
Yeah, I should say that I wasn't aware when I did my dissertation that it was not only a dissertation studying the effects of cooperation and competition, it was a study of two different distributive principles. The cooperative principle was an equality distribution. The competitive principle was an equity distribution. Can I stop for a second for water?
So you gave us 6 minutes, which is that 6 minutes left? Yeah, so that's what I thought. Okay, so we've covered a little bit of the theory of cooperation and competition and its implications for conflict. We've talked a little bit about the social justice connection.
But I was going to make an acknowledgement, which is particularly relevant since Mel Lerner is also getting a Lifetime Achievement Award. As I began to say, I wasn't aware when I did my dissertation that I was doing a dissertation about two different distributive justice canons, equity and equality. It was only later when I got more actively involved in the social psychology of justice research and theory that I became aware of that. Mel Lerner was the guy who got me more actively involved in the field of the social psychology of justice. Mel invited me to a conference in Canada on injustice in North America. And I wrote a paper on awakening the sense of injustice, which appeared in a book published about the conference, which I guess no one has ever heard of. And secondly...
But it was subsequently published again in Distributive Justice as a chapter.
Yes.
Yes, it's available there as well.
As a more amplified, further developed chapter.
Right.
Secondly, he invited me to write a paper for an issue of the Journal of Social Issues on justice that he was editing. And I wrote a paper on equity, equality, and need, comparing these distributive justice principles. It was a theoretical paper. So I want to credit Mel Lerner with getting me into this field more directly. And when I got into the field, this is a footnote, I found that I disliked equity theory, which was a very prominent feature of the field at that time. I thought it was a very culturally limited theory based upon sort of the American experience rather than a general theory of social psychology that could apply to cavemen and spacemen as well as to Americans and Britons and wherever.
Because it had some basic assumptions of meritocracies. Or
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, now let me
maybe talk a little bit about some of the applications of your work, some of the practical applications or implications.
Well, that would be very good. And let me say that a lot of the practical applications were not made by me. And let me say also that when you, so to speak, throw your pebbles into the sea, you don't know, your theoretical and research pebble, you don't know where they're going to land and who's going to pick them up and use them. So a lot of this is due to the people who found the ideas interesting and the research interesting and went and used them to good effect. My work on cooperation and competition was done essentially in a classroom. I was teaching at MIT introductory psychology, and I used my large introductory psychology course to break it down into small 5-person groups and and the experiments had educational effects as well as tutorial effects by me. In any case, one of the important effects of that research was the fact that David Johnson was a graduate student of mine. He became very interested in that research, and he saw that it could be of great value to education. And he worked with his brother, Roger, and some of his other siblings to develop a lot of research, theory, and practice in the field of cooperative learning. And literally hundreds of thousands of teachers have been taught by the Johnsons in the principles of cooperative learning. And he very generously acknowledges my role in stimulating his work.
He has other practical applications in educational settings as well, in terms of constructive controversies and peacemaker
Absolutely.
programs in schools, and so he's taken the basic ideas and applied them in different ways in educational settings.
Absolutely, and he and others have also applied them in industrial settings.
Right.
The second application was the research on segregation in public housing. The Newark public housing, which was the segregated housing, immediately changed its segregated policy to an integrated policy as a result of a lot of discussions that followed once my research was published. My research was also used by the lawyers. It was part of the brief that the lawyers used in Brown versus the Board of Education, which ended public segregation of public schools in the United States. My research was not the major aspect of that brief. My most important effects were in the area of conflict resolution beyond that of cooperative learning. There were many of my students became active theorists and researchers and practitioners in this field, and they helped to develop both the academic field and the practical field of conflict resolution. That meant that there was development of training in schools, in industry, in the UN, and other settings of how to manage conflicts more constructively. For me, the most thrilling application of my work took place, without my knowledge, in Poland many years ago, when Poland was having a problem between the communist government and Solidarity, which wanted to change the authoritarian communist government and replace it. Two scholars, Janusz Rakowski and Janusz Gierlach, had read my book on the resolution of conflict, constructive and destructive processes, which was published in 1973. Janusz Rakowski had also published articles in some of the leading journals about my work, urging that some of the principles following from my work be followed. And they had an important impact on the negotiations between the communist government and Solidarity. Janusz Rakowski was one of the leading negotiators, was co-chairman of the political committee in the negotiations between the communist government and Solidarity. Janusz Gierlach had provided a good deal of education to the negotiators in Solidarity on constructive negotiations. Well, in any case, they say that my work had some influence in making the transition from the communist government to the solidarity government a peaceful one. And that is thrilling. And because, as Rakovsky in a paper he sent me also says, the communist peaceful transfer of power in Poland to solidarity may have set example for some of the peaceful transfers of power in other Eastern European countries. Mm-hmm. So I was very thrilled when what was it, 2 years ago, we were at a meeting on intractable conflicts.
In Kaziermish, Poland.
And which Peter helped to organize. And at the end of the meeting, Rakovsky just got up and made a statement to the effect of my helpful contribution to that. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
We probably just have a few minutes left, and so I wondered if there was any concluding thoughts that you wanted to have that might be particularly relevant for the audience of this award.
Yes, I have always called myself a grandiose rather than a picayune theorist. So let me make or read a concluding statement which is somewhat grandiose. We live in a time when our planet is in peril from global warming, extremely dangerous weapons, gross injustices and inequalities within and between nations, bitter destructive conflicts between nations and within nations, as well as between different ethnic and religious groups, and a growing competition for the increasing scarcity of some vital natural resources. We also live in a period of much hope. There is growing global consciousness, increasing sense of international community, and much scientific knowledge to deal with our problems. To realize our hope, all of us, in the various ways available to us, must foster cooperation and the constructive resolution of conflict at all levels of our social world. Of course, we should vote for political leaders who will do this, but we can also contribute much as educators, social scientists, parents, and citizens. And let me thank you again for this wonderful award.
Thank you.
Is it within 30 minutes?